Okay, greetings and welcome. This is part 2 of our personal introduction. And so, originally I was going to do this in chronological order, but now I'm going to do it in, just like a stream of consciousness thing of what comes to mind. So there's a lot of interesting topics we can discuss. And so, I'll discuss whatever comes to mind. And we did a video a little while ago on sungazing, and that is a very interesting topic. And before we get into other things, I would just like to expand on that a little bit. Oh, and by the way, if there was some kind of malfunction on the URL that I gave for the blog site, but I checked it out the other day, and whatever is wrong is working now. So I will post the link to that page in the description to this video so that if you want to look at it, it's a very fascinating field. In fact, even NASA was doing experiments with the Indian guru who popularized this and who made it famous, shall we say. And so they had him in a room under 24-hour surveillance cameras so that they could see whether he ate or drank anything. And I believe this went on for at least 45 days, maybe longer. And he didn't eat and he didn't drink, and he was, just normal afterwards. Because one benefit of sungazing is that you can eventually stop eating if you choose. In fact, there was a movie made some years ago called Eat the Sun, and it was discussing how sungazing would lower your appetite and would eventually just eliminate your appetite so that you didn't have to eat anymore. Now, I had researched this topic before, and this is the easiest method that I saw of accomplishing this, but there is another method. Another word for this is autotroph, and there are other autotrophs who have used other methods to attain this same result of not having to eat or not having to drink, because what you can do is you can set the cells of your body to directly pull the energy they need to function from the surrounding universe. I know it sounds kind of weird, but the DNA in each one of your cells is like a little coil, like a little antenna. And you can train it, each cell, you can train your cells to pull in the energy they need from the environment, because there's plenty of energy all around you at all times. In fact, you're energy yourself. So the idea that you have to eat is fictional. The idea that you have to drink is fictional. Your body can generate all the food and water that it needs and pull it in directly from the environment, but your body must first be trained. Now, the other method of creating an autotroph is to go on longer and longer fasts over a period of time. For example, 1 week you'll fast 1 day. The next week maybe you'll fast 2 days. The next week maybe you'll fast 3 days. And it just goes on and on like this, although it shouldn't be done too fast. Because what actually kills people, what actually makes them sick, is the poison that is accumulated in their cells. That is what has, that's what will kill you. So if you go on, let's say, a 40-day fast, okay, and you do a cold turkey, you haven't fasted before, you haven't done anything before, then as your cells are releasing the fat that they contain, they will release the poisons stored in those fat cells too fast for your body to process and can actually kill you. So, and even on a vegetarian diet, even on a fruitarian diet, you're still getting small amounts of poison into your system, although the fruitarian diet is the most clean. And of course, the diet that includes meat is the least clean and has the most toxins. So these toxins, they build up in your system over your entire lifetime. And so if you try to go cold turkey, then that is when you die. So sun gazing appears to do this cleansing process in a much more orderly fashion, and in a fashion that is more natural and etc. And so therefore, you don't have the terrible side effects that you would normally have. Because in order to use the other technique, you need to also convert your diet from whatever it is to a fully vegan diet, and then you need to convert it again from a vegan diet into a fruitarian diet, and then from there you can convert that to autotropism. But there are autotropes, believe it or not, who are weightlifters and engage in other strenuous sports, and they're not emaciated husks, is what I'm saying. So this idea that you have to eat in order to sustain yourself is just that. It's an idea that has been programmed into your mind. Now, most people don't realize just how marvelous their minds are. And basically, whatever you believe can be made to come about, but with one caveat: you must believe. You must believe. And that's how faith healers heal people. It's not actually the faith healer that is healing them, it is the person themselves. And there's one quote in the Bible from Jesus Christ, among others, where Christ said to this person who was, I think the woman had some kind of bleeding condition, that she was continuously bleeding all the time at a low level. And so all she did was she reached out and she touched Jesus' robes, and Jesus felt the power being drained from him, and the woman was healed. Jesus turned around and he said, "By thy faith have you been healed." In other words, he wasn't taking credit for it. See, a lot of bad things have arisen around this legendary figure, Jesus Christ. And I think he really did exist, but I do think that organized religion has totally perverted his message. We're not going to get into religion here. I don't believe anymore in organized religion. And that's a whole other topic for another time. Because for 30 plus years, I was part of a very extreme Protestant sect, shall we say. I won't give their name here. but it's the same basic severity as people like the Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. And I was a member of that cult, and cult it was, for over 30 years. And that shows the amount of mind control that is exhibited against you as you go through whatever system that religion might have. So the basic thing that a lot of religions will do is they will instill fear into you, whether it's fear of going to hell or fear of this or fear of that, fear of God's wrath, etc. And you've heard the expression fear religion. Well, at its core, all organized religion is fear, and they use this fear to control the people. And the people are usually completely controlled and hoodwinked into believing whatever that religion says, right or wrong. And that's exactly what this organized religion that I used to belong to was. It's only in the past 5 years or so that I have woke up to a wasted lifetime of, well, because of that organization, because of that church. I wasted many, many years of my life. And so when I joined that church, I started as, oh dear, when I joined that church, let's see, I can't remember what I was going to say now. But anyway, when I joined that church, oh, let's see, I was about 19 years old. Yeah, I remember now, because I was one of the youngest people baptized by a minister of that church. And they had a very restrictive practice, and they had a very rigid mindset. In other words, they believed that the ministry was basically infallible. And in fact, I remember from, a couple sermons that I listened to over the years, and they said, brethren, whether or not the ministry is correct, God will back it up because he has this government in his church. So, if you obey what the minister tells you to say, then you will be blessed. Otherwise, you will come under a curse, even if the minister turns out later to have been wrong through some error in his judgment. And that's what I tell you today. If you have proved that this is God's church, and you have proved that I am his apostle, then for you to disobey what I have said is rebellion against Jesus Christ. And your very salvation is at stake. See, and that's the kind of mind control that they used on the people over those many, many years. They just drilled that in and drilled that in and drilled that in. Now, I remember one time the founder of the church gave a message, and he said, some of you people are just gossiping and talking about the ministry and talking about God's apostle, because he called himself God's apostle, of course. And he said, I am going to pause right now in this sermon, and all of you that don't want to listen to do what God has told you to do, you can stand up right now and you can get out. Just stand out right now and leave. And don't let the door slam you in the ass on the way out. And not one person had the courage to stand up. Not one person had the courage to stand up. Now, I could spend hours discussing some of the weird things that that religion was promulgating over the years. But I think with this little sample, you can get the general idea of just how mind-controlled through fear these people were, and how much they feared to disobey the minister. Although, as humans usually do, they did anyway and made excuses for themselves. But it was a very extreme church, and I will share more tidbits with you as time goes on. In fact, I had a degree of self-deception myself, and I thought, well, I'll just tell you right now, I thought that I was going to be the successor to the leader of the church when he died, because he was very elderly at the time. And he didn't die until he was 93 years old. And he was somewhat senile, but I'll tell you what, he was still sharp as a tack. He was still sharp as a tack. And the state of California, because the government has been on a campaign for many years to destroy religious freedom. They've also been trying to destroy the freedom to bear arms and the freedom of speech, etc. All these freedoms that we've had are under attack. But one of the places they started was with the freedom of religion. So in 1979, the Attorney General of the state of California, because the church was headquartered in California, he got this idea to make an example of this church, because he figured at that time, I don't know, he was in his late 80s, probably 88 or 89 at the time. He wasn't in his 90s then. He lasted, let's see, he died in January of 1986 at 93 years old. So in 1979, well, I guess he was like 85 or something then. But anyway, that's not important. They thought that he was a senile old man, and not only that, he had almost went into semi-retirement and was living in Tucson, Arizona. So he thought, well, this church is ripe for the pickings. It'll just fall over. It'll just fall over if I just touch it. That's what the Attorney General of California thought. And so, in 1979, he swooped in with a receivership, which they used in ex parte order, to swoop in and take over the headquarters of the church. Now, all the income for that church was mailed by the brethren in the form of checks into the church, at that time in California. Now, after this attack, it didn't go well for that Attorney General, because what the leader started doing at that time, he was taking full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal, which I think at that time was costing about $13,000 a pop or more than that. I don't remember. It was very expensive for that time. And he was taking out these full-page ads every week in the Wall Street Journal to make sure that that Attorney General saw what he wanted him to see. Now, I remember, I was living in Ohio at the time. I remember the minister getting up in church, and he said, well, the Attorney General has illegally seized the church, and any money going into California will be appropriated by the receivership. He said, therefore, and he said, now I'm going to put myself into contempt of court in California, but I don't care, because my loyalty is to Jesus Christ. And he said, you need to send your checks to our leader in Tucson, Arizona. Effective immediately. Do not send any more contributions to California. Send them to, and they gave the name and the address. And oh, it was just amazing. It was just amazing. A huge flood of mail started arriving in Tucson, Arizona. And at that time, the church was making about $1 million a day. The income was averaging about $1 million a day. $300 million or so a year was what that church was taking in, and that was in 1979. So in today's dollars, that would be a lot more money. That would be a lot more money today. And so all of a sudden, all these small checks started pouring in to the P.O. box in Tucson, Arizona. And for a short time, it just overwhelmed the local Arizona bank. Just overwhelmed the local Arizona bank. But that attorney general didn't get one more dime of the church's money. And so that was one of the first examples of the government trying to take over a church and how it was failed and how things turned back on him. And the leader of that church had a habit of doing things like that, where you would think, well, he'd be easy pickings, etc. And he wasn't. He wasn't. He was still smart and sharp as a tack. And he was in his late 80s at that time. So, actually, whatever religious freedom is left in the United States can be attributed to that church and their brave stance against the state of California. In fact, in the headquarters area, they started having continuous church services in the Hall of Administration to keep the receiver out. To keep the receiver out from entering the buildings. And so that was quite an adventure. That was quite an adventure. And now I went to California to the church's college starting in 1980. But by 1980, well, no, I remember 1980 was when they finally had their victory over the state of California. And they, it's really hilarious. They got the state legislature to pass a law to take away the Attorney General's jurisdiction from churches. And so therefore, they had no choice but to drop the lawsuit, and the church won on that day. So, I guess the lesson we can learn from that, besides the mind control, is that you need to take a stand. If you strongly believe in something, and you take a stand against this evil government, they will most likely be forced to back down. And that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing in when we start our series on the sovereign status, etc. Because you can literally force the government to back down and stop their illegal activities. So anyway, I don't know if we're going to continue that. That was quite an interesting story. But I have other stories I can tell about that church. I don't usually like to remember that. But my mind was completely under their spell, was completely under control of that organization. Unfortunately, years later, after I had left that church, I took up with another organization, which was also another mind control cult. And this one was a New Age psychic type cult. It was a New Age psychic type cult. And and I do actually believe that the leader of that particular cult has the psychic powers, or a lot of the psychic powers that he claims to have. In fact, I learned quite a bit from him, and but I found out later that he had borrowed, or shall I say, ripped off, bits and pieces from other organizations. In other words, all the things that he said, oh, I've discovered this or I've discovered that. Well, he ended up borrowing that from other organizations. For example, he has a meditation method, which is very good and gets much better results than any other method that I have seen. In fact, we have a presentation on that, and I put that on the sun-gazing video, the two-part series of podcasts that I did some years ago, teaching you this meditation technique. Now, that's the basic meditation technique, and there's another one with the tones, which I may get into at some point. But in any event, I began to notice, after being around there for a while, that his behavior was very similar to what the other cult leaders had been. In other words, he appeared to be nice and he appeared to be etc. But as you got to know it better and as you got more familiar and you got more drawn in, you began to realize what a jerk he really was. And so he seems to have a hold on his people and has created a mind control cult. In fact, he did one demonstration. Of course, I was ignorant at the time. He did one demonstration where, and this was at one of their annual retreats, he did one demonstration where they had a big black cube in the center of a big auditorium and had the people going around it in a circular fashion, just like the Muslims do in Mecca. Their big black cube is called the Kaaba. And the Muslims, when they do their pilgrimage to Mecca, they do the same thing. Now, I didn't know at the time that this big black cube is a big tip-off and a symbol for the worship of Saturn. And that gets into a whole other story. David Icke has a very good presentation on Saturn and what it does. And I wish I would have known at that time, because at that time, then I would have been aware that he was in cahoots with the Illuminati and people like that, because that's a kind of ceremony that they would set up, and he had I don't know how many people, 20 or so people, sitting inside the cube as the people were circulating around it on the outside in a darkened room, with really strange music going off and strobe lights going. And supposedly the people on the inside had an experience where they sort of blinked out of this reality and went on to another one. It was a very interesting thing. But I found out later that this black cube was a component of Saturn worship way back in ancient history. And therefore, that's exactly what the Muslims are doing today, is they're going around their black cube, the Kabbalah, and who knows what's inside that thing. So it's an ancient ceremony and a tip-off that it has something to do with the Illuminati and Saturn worship. And I'm not going to, I could go into the story of Saturn, but I'm not going to go into it. For example, how you have these, funny square hats when you graduate, and how you wear black robes. Well, that is Saturn worship too. The square funny hat that you have on, because square seems to be a symbol for Saturn, and black robes also have a symbol, is also symbolic of Saturn. That's why priests in various churches wear black robes. They wear black robes because that shows who they are actually worshiping, and it isn't the god they say they're worshiping, it is Saturn. That goes way back. Now there is, what's really funny is apparently there is a storm, a permanent storm, just like Jupiter has its, big red spot that's been around for hundreds of years. Well, Saturn has a storm at its North Pole that is a square, a cube. And, there's other weird things associated with this. We'll get into that at some other time. It's a real fascinating discussion, because this goes way back. This goes way back before humans were on this earth. That's how far back it goes. Now, it may have something to do with the Archons or the Anunnaki, etc., whatever you want to call them. But that is basically who is ruling mankind, but mankind doesn't know it because they don't understand the symbology of this whole thing. Anyway, I think we've covered enough ground for today. And, I think it's probably better if I take little snippets like this rather than try and go through a chronological order of my life, because my experiences are so vast and so amazing that to try and do it in chronological order, first of all, would be more boring, and secondly, it would just take me forever, and then I wouldn't be able to have interesting things to discuss like I do right now. But in any event, I eventually came out of that cult too, because I noticed the similarities between that leader and the other leader, and I said to a certain person who knew what I was talking about, and that's an interesting story too about how I found Evil Richard, because that cult had its own Satan, and he was nicknamed Evil Richard. That wasn't his real name, but that was his nickname, was Evil Richard. Now, the interesting thing is that Evil Richard's last name is the same as my last name. Is the same as my last name. And, Richard and I'll continue to use the pseudonym as opposed to the real name. Richard and I, in discussing things, we came to the conclusion that actually the leader of that organization, because he was one of the first students that was in this cult, and it was from the eastern part of the country, Rhode Island, in fact, and I was from Ohio, but I was a little bit older, and it appears, looking back, that I sort of retraced the steps of where he was going to be in the future and where Richard would be in the future, but I was there previously. For example, they were around the Venice Beach area of California, and I was there before them by about 10 years or so. And, that's just a fascinating story. And everywhere I had been, he followed like 10 years later. I lived in Sunland, the Sunland, Tahunga, La Crescenta area above Glendale, and he lived in that same area about 10 years later. It's just very, very interesting. You wonder what the universe is doing. You wonder what the universe is really doing. And it's doing weirder things than you can possibly imagine. Well, anyway, that's enough for you to digest today. So until next time, this is M. John Allen saying goodbye, everybody.